Hourly, salary, exempt, non-exempt? You hear these terms all the time, but what the heck do they mean? Hi, entrepreneurs. I'm Vicky Brown, and you're in the right place if you want to engage your team, boost your business, and grow your leadership muscle. When most people say someone is hourly, they mean the person is paid by the hour versus getting a flat weekly or annual amount, so $15 per hour versus $60,000 a year. This is just the definition of how you are paying the person, but it's important to understand that how you pay someone has to be determined by the what of their classification. Is their job classified as non-exempt or exempt? What? Well, the people responsible for the regulations around employment, the Department of Labor, the IRS, your local state employment departments, consider everyone who works in the U.S. as eligible for overtime. That's right, you heard me right. You get overtime. You get overtime. Everyone gets overtime. That is, unless your job is exempt from the overtime rules. See, that's how they get exempt, meaning exempt from overtime rules, and non-exempt, meaning not exempt from the overtime rules. So, how do you know if your job is exempt from overtime? Well, the feds, and even some states, put together specific guidelines that a job has to meet in order to qualify as exempt from overtime. Everybody gets in on setting the rules, because when you pay overtime, you also have to pay payroll taxes on top of the overtime amount. And to put it mildly, the IRS wants their payroll taxes. There are 6 exempt categories. Keep in mind, you have to see how the job stacks up against the exempt categories to figure out if it qualifies as exempt, again, meaning not eligible for overtime, or non-exempt, meaning eligible for overtime. Those categories are executive, administrative, professional, computer professional, outside sales, and highly compensated. I'll give you a quick overview of each category, but keep 2 things in mind. Number 1, I am absolutely certain that you have a much larger number of non-exempt employees than you think you have. I know this because it's almost always the case. This is the most common misclassification, classifying a job as exempt when it should be non-exempt. And number 2, I cannot impress upon you strongly enough that you need to be very careful before you classify a job as exempt. Don't be shy about reaching out to your labor attorney, and yes, you should have one, if you can't figure it out. This is not a good calculation to get wrong. It can be very expensive. Okay, back to the exemption categories. First up, executive. Among other things, the person must direct the work of at least 2 or more other full-time employees. So that means having authority over them, giving them work, evaluating performance, recommending to hire or fire, or actually hiring or firing. And they have to be paid a minimum amount. At the federal level, that amount in 2020 is $684 a week. But remember when I said some states have their own guidelines? Well, California is one of those states, and the minimum salary level in California is twice whatever the minimum wage is on a weekly basis. So in English, if the California minimum wage is $20 an hour, it's not, but that'll make my math much easier, then the weekly amount would be $20 times 40 hours, which equals $800. That means in California, you would have to pay an exempt level person at least twice that, or $1,600 a week. Next category, the administrative category. No, this does not mean administrative assistant. The administrative exemption is for jobs that involve management of your or your customers' general business operations. It also has the minimum salary requirement we talked about earlier. And on top of all that, there's a special phrase the regulators use. Includes the exercise of discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. Everybody always asks me what that means, and it's such a hazy statement. I have to refer them directly to the Department of Labor's explanation, which is, In general, the exercise of discretion and independent judgment involves the comparison and the evaluation of possible courses of conduct and acting or making a decision after the various possibilities have been considered. There's more, but you get the idea. I'll put the link to the actual Department of Labor overview in the description below. Onward to the next category, professional. This category also isn't necessarily what it sounds like. Sure, we're all professionals, or at least we try to be. But this exemption category is for learned professionals. So among other things, the job must require advanced knowledge in a field of science or learning, kind of like a CPA. Now let me be clear. If you have a bookkeeping job, but the person you have in the job is a CPA, that does not mean the job meets the professional exemption. All these exemption categories apply to the minimum requirements of the position, not the knowledge or experience of a person who may have the job right now. If it isn't a requirement to hold a CPA, but it's a nice to have, I'm afraid that job is still considered non-exempt. And again, the professional exemption has the minimum salary requirement we talked about earlier. By the way, there's also a subcategory of creative professional, but this generally applies to performers and artists. Next up, computer professional. This one is closer to what you think it is, but with a twist. Of course, it's an analyst, computer programmer, engineer, etc. It is not someone who manages and fixes workstations. This category also has a minimum salary requirement, but they're a bit different than the other categories. At the federal level, there's a weekly minimum and an hourly minimum. For California, there's an annual and monthly minimum. Surprisingly, the outside sales exemption is precisely what it sounds like. The job has to be sales done outside the employer's place of business. So, if you have someone doing cold calls from your office, that would not qualify. And finally, the highly compensated category. If the position pays, again, as of 2020, $107,432 per year or more, it's considered exempt from overtime by the federal government, but not by California. We don't have a highly compensated exemption category. So that means, oddly, someone could, in theory, make $200,000 and still be eligible for overtime if they didn't meet one of the other exempt categories. So, circling back to our original question, you can now see that whether someone is paid hourly or salary is really determined by their classification of exempt or non-exempt. And beyond the pay, there are other rules around dealing with exempt and non-exempt employees. If you'd like an episode on the rules, let me know in the comments below. A few additional words. As I mentioned, the minimum qualifications for the job must meet the exempt category requirements. Neither you nor the employee can choose to make the position exempt. It has to meet one of the exempt categories. However, you can choose to make a job that would otherwise be exempt non-exempt. The feds don't really care if you choose to pay someone overtime. And don't forget to reach out to your labor attorney if you get stuck. Links to the Department of Labor and the California exemption categories and salary minimums are in the description below. If you found this information helpful, please subscribe and share. And remember, your inspired leadership is the secret sauce to having a high-performance team and a wildly successful business you'll love. See you next time on Leader's Journey.